Hey everybody, me and Joe from Legend Hobby. So in this video, let's talk about soldering. I'm going to cover how to solder um, just typical battery connectors. You can use this same technique on any connector you like to use. Deans, you can use bullet connectors to wire up your ESCs, your batteries, all this stuff. I hear a lot of people out there, they don't understand how to solder batteries and they end up buying the wrong kind and they have to have somebody else solder. So I thought I'd put together a quick video on how I do it. I've been using this for years. I've never had any failures on any airplanes as far as soldering joints. And it's actually very easy and it only takes a few things to make it work properly. So one of the first things you're going to want to get is a good quality soldering iron. I happen to like the Weller brand of soldering irons. For my electronics, this 10 to 30 amp unit is perfect for that. You can pick these up just about anywhere. If you're going to solder something more robust like gear or struts or something, that's going to be a different setup, and I'll cover that in the different video. It's going to be totally different than what you're doing with this. But for the electronics, you know, your battery connectors, Deans, all that kind of stuff, this type of soldering iron is going to work perfectly. You're going to make sure you have a sponge in here. You need to have this wet. That's going to help you keep your soldering tip clean. And here in a little bit, I'll show you how that works. One of the other things you're going to need is some type of jig or some type of holding device. I happen to like the Mr. Jig system. It actually works really good. It's got a spot on here for Deans and other types of connectors here, as you can see. You can also use the helping hands type things. These are really handy items to have. You can pick them up relatively cheaply, and they're just good to have in the shop for just about anything. One of the other things you're going to want to get is a nice selection of shrink tubing. You're going to want this to finish off your connectors so that they don't touch. The positive and negatives shouldn't touch, and that's what this is going to be for. A little added item that's always good to have is some of this soldering wick. All this is like a copper, braided copper wire. And if you get messy with one of your soldering jobs, you can use this to heat the solder up, and then you can pull it off and it wicks to this so that you can clean your mess up relatively easy. It actually works really good, and this is really, really cheap. One of the other things a lot of people don't think about for soldering is a heat gun. So what I use the heat gun for in my process is I use it to shrink the heat tube. I don't like to use a lighter on it because of the gassing. If you want to use something on it, a torch isn't the worst thing because you don't actually have to hold the flame underneath it to get it work. But you really shouldn't use a lighter to shrink the shrink tubing because it off gases and it's not healthy for you. So those are a few of the things. I like to use just typical electrical solder. So I like to use in my electrical applications, I use the 6040 rosin cure solder, and always make sure you have a good flux. I like the paste flux better than I like the liquid flux because I feel like this not as messy and I feel like it works a lot better. And we'll get into what that does here in just a few minutes. One of the things that you're also going to want to have is a nice acid brush. You need the acid brush to use with the paste flux. All the stuff's readily available at just about any hardware store you can find. Nothing crazy. So let's get into this process and see how it works. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I've got a couple of different connectors here. I've just taken some spare wire I had. I didn't need to really wire up anything right this second, so I'm going to go ahead and just do it like this. I have a Dean's T-style connector and I have a 5mm bullet, and I'm just going to show you how this system works with both so that you get an understanding of how things work. One of the first things I'm going to tell you that's very important is your heat shrink tubing. You always want to make sure you get your heat shrink tubing on your wire before you solder your connector on. I know I've done this a bunch. I know bunches of people out there that have also done this a bunch, and nothing sucks worse than you get your project all soldered up and ready to go and realize you didn't put your heat shrink tubing on there. So always make sure you put your heat shrink tubing on before you take any of these steps, and you're going to be much happier. Okay, so now that we've got everything set up and ready to go, the next step is going to be to tin our wires and our connectors. You're always going to want to make sure you tin these wires. What that is you're going to put some solder on the wires and the connectors so that when you get ready to actually solder it, it goes together quickly. So go ahead and get your wire tin first, just like that. And then we want to tin our connectors next. So you can see here I'm going to simulate putting this on a Dean style connector or a T connector. And then I'm simply going to tin the connector. So same thing, I'm going to get the heat down onto the connector to warm it up. And then once that starts to flow, that gives me a nice little dollop of solder right there on that connector to work with. So this is how this is going to work. So you've got a little bit of solder on your connector. You've got a little bit of solder on your wire. Now all you need to do is place the heat on the wire, and it flows right straight to the connector. You want to hold it for a second, and then now you can see we have a perfectly perfect soldering joint that's never going to come apart. At this point, what you would do is I would wait until it cools before sliding your heat shrink up on your connector. You can speed that along. You can put a little bit of cool water on it. Let me see if I can get you a good view of that soldering. So there's what it's going to look like when you're done. Because you tinned it, cleaned it, and soldered it properly, you've now got a good connection on your soldering joint. So now you just simply put your heat shrink on. Take your heat gun. I like to use a heat gun. I don't like to use a lighter. I know some guys swear by using a lighter. I just feel like the gas is on the inside. I'm not a big fan. So just go ahead and use your heat gun and shrink that heat shrink down. It only takes a second. And now that would be a perfect soldering joint for one side of my battery. Just like that. Okay, now that same technique can be used for anything that you're going to solder electronically. So if you got ESCs, if you've got, you know, bullet connectors, if you've got any of that stuff, this is all going to work the same. So I'll demonstrate the same process on a bullet connector. So I have my bullet connector here. I have my wire. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little wire snippers. I'm going to snip off just a little bit on the end. Doesn't take much. Then I'm going to twist that wire together on the end. Just like that. I'm going to go ahead and tin my wire and my connector. Again, tinning is simply just the act of putting some solder on these pieces so that they go together quickly when you get ready. Put a little bit of heat on the end of the wire, get a little bit of solder on there. That's going to be good to go. With bullet connectors, you want to be a little bit stingy with the solder because there's only so much room in these connectors. I'm going to go ahead now and tin my connector. So this is a 5mm bullet connector. Sometimes these take a little bit longer to heat up. So just make sure you've got a way to hold on to them so you don't get burnt on your fingers. So there you go. That one's tinned and ready to go. Then simply take your connector and your wire. Since they're both tinned, all I need to do is get my wire close, heat up my solder. It will flow on there. I leave it set for a second. And now I've got a good solder joint on the end of this. I would slide my heat shrink up on there. Go ahead and cool it off a little bit. Now you can see here I've went ahead and applied my heat shrink, and I have a perfect female bullet connector ready to go. Okay, so there you go. That's how I do my electrical soldering. Remember that this is for use for any type of connector. You can do bullet connectors, EC3, EC5s. You could do Deans like I did here, no problem. Any of that kind of stuff that you need to solder for your batteries or the setup that you're using, this will work perfectly. I hope this helps you get through it. I know a lot of people are intimidated by this step, but it's really pretty easy. As always, thank you very much for watching and have a legendary day.